So you're getting ready for those coding interviews, right? I know how it goes. It's easy to feel like you just have to memorize every algorithm under the sun. But what if I told you there's a whole other side to this? Like, what if it's more about training your brain to be, like, a total problem-solving machine?
Yeah, it's like an athlete training for a big game. You need more than just raw talent to really nail it when it counts.
That's such a good point. You sent me some really fascinating articles about this, and one thing that really jumped out was this whole idea of a growth mindset. And honestly, it feels relevant to so much more than just coding, you know?
Oh, absolutely. This whole concept, and it was really developed by psychologist Carol Dweck, suggests that our abilities, even in something as technical as, coding, they're not fixed. We can actually genuinely get better through dedication, practice, just effort.
Okay, so it's not like some people are just like born coding geniuses. There's like hope for the rest of us.
Yeah. Exactly. It's about shifting your thinking. Instead of thinking, I can't do this, it's more like, okay, I can't do this yet, but I can learn and I can grow. And the article really emphasizes how crucial this is, especially, in a high-pressure situation like a coding interview.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah.
I can totally relate to that. Like, I remember when I was prepping for my first interview and I got stuck on this sorting algorithm. Ugh. I was so ready to just give up. If I had embraced that growth mindset back then, I probably would have approached it so differently. What do you think?
I think that's a perfect example, honestly. The article talks about this study where they gave students a really hard puzzle to solve. And the ones who had that growth mindset, they were way more likely to see it as like an opportunity to learn, to kind of push themselves. Whereas the people with that fixed mindset, they were like ready to throw in the towel.
It's wild how much our mindset, can impact how we actually perform. So how can someone, actually cultivate this growth mindset?
The article suggests, trying to reframe challenges. Think of them as opportunities. So instead of getting stuck on finding that right answer right away, focus on that process. Like, how are you learning? How are you problem solving?
You know what that reminds me of? It reminds me of something else the article talked about, working memory. It's like, on top of trying to solve this already complex problem, you're also trying to juggle all these different pieces of information in your head at the same time.
Oh, for sure. Working memory, it's like that mental workspace, right? Where we're holding on to information while we're actively working with it. And let me tell you, it gets overloaded fast, especially during something like a coding interview.
Oh, tell me about it. I've definitely had those moments where I feel like my brain is about to short circuit. But how do you actually, deal with that? Telling someone to just remember better doesn't really feel helpful in the heat of the moment.
You're right, it doesn't. But luckily, the article does have some good strategies for this. One that really resonated with me was chunking. Have you ever noticed how much easier it is to remember a phone number, in chunks, rather than this long string of numbers?
Oh, absolutely. If I tried to memorize a whole phone number all at once, it would be gone before you even finished dialing.
Yeah.
But if you break it up, area code, prefix, the actual number, suddenly it sticks.
Mm-hmm.
How does that work with, coding, though?
It's the same idea, honestly. You can group related pieces of code together. So instead of remembering every single line, group them into these logical phases, or functions.
So it's kind of like if you have a really messy room and then you organize it, suddenly everything's easier to find, right?
Yeah.
Easier to remember where it is.
Exactly. And this actually ties into another powerful technique from the article, which is visualization.
Yes. The power of drawing things out. I've always found that so helpful for myself. It's like you're turning these abstract concepts into something you can actually see, something tangible.
Exactly. For a lot of people, visualizing the problem, whether it's drawing out a data structure or just sketching out the flow of the algorithm, it can be a game changer. It gets different parts of your brain working, and that can really help make your understanding way more solid.
That makes total sense. So we've talked about the mindset piece and now some helpful memory tricks. But what other, mental tools can we add to our problem-solving toolkit? What's next in this coding bootcamp for our brains?
Well, get ready to put on your detective hat, because next up is the power of pattern and analogies in problem solving.
Ooh, patterns and analogies. Love a good detective story. But how does that apply to, the nitty-gritty of coding?
You'd be surprised. You know that feeling when you're looking at a problem and it's like, wait a minute, I've seen something like this before.
Oh, yeah, those moments. Like a light bulb just goes off.
Exactly. That's your brain making connections, recognizing patterns. And the thing about these coding interviews, they often rely on these variations of, these common themes.
Okay, so it's not about, rote memorization of a million different solutions. It's more about understanding the underlying pattern and then like adapting it to the situation.
You got it. The article actually encourages like aspiring coders to become these pattern detectives, and it gives some cool examples like two-pointer problems, sliding window techniques, and then there's always the classic dynamic programming.
Dynamic programming. Now, there's a term I'm sure a lot of our listeners have come across, and maybe with a little bit of, I don't know, fear and fascination.
Yeah.
I've heard it described as elegant and also kind of brain-bending.
Yeah, a little bit of both. But it's a super powerful technique, especially for problems that involve breaking down a big, complex problem into these smaller, overlapping sub-problems.
Right, right.
And the article gives this example of using dynamic programming to, let's see, give a specific coding example from the source and break it down slightly.
Okay, that's a really good example. And I can see how, like, recognizing that pattern would just be so clutch in an interview.
Yeah.
It's like you have this shortcut to the solution.
Totally. And actually, this all ties into this other fascinating concept from the article, analogical thinking. Have you ever noticed how sometimes, like, the solution to a problem in one part of your life can spark an idea for something totally different?
Oh, all the time. Like, just the other day, I was trying to organize my bookshelf. I have way too many books. And it hit me that I could use the same sorting algorithm that I was practicing for, coding.
See, perfect example. You made that connection, right? Organizing your books, sorting data, it's all connected.
It is.
It's all about these underlying patterns. It's finding those similarities, even across different areas, and that can lead to some seriously creative breakthroughs.
I love that. So it's not just about being good at code. It's about, like, being observant, drawing inspiration from, well, everywhere. Okay, so the article also talks about this other concept, metacognition, and I have to say, it sounds kind of intimidating.
I know, it's a big word, but really, it's a simple idea. It just means being aware of your own thought process, like being your own coding coach,
Okay, I like that. So how do you actually, like, coach yourself while you're coding? What does that look like?
Well, one technique is to actually talk yourself through your process out loud, like you're explaining it to someone.
Even if it's just your rubber duck.
Even if it's your rubber duck, because just by saying it out loud, you can uncover all sorts of things, hidden assumptions, potential problems.
It's true. It's like when you're trying to explain something to someone else, that's when you actually figure it out yourself.
Exactly. And another strategy is to, like, build in checkpoints as you're going. It's so easy to get lost in the weeds when you're coding.
Totally. You get so focused on just making the code work, you lose track of the bigger picture.
Exactly. So take a step back, ask yourself, does this approach still make sense? What other options are there?
So it's like those mile markers you see in a marathon, right? They help you keep track of where you are, make sure you're still on the right path. This is so cool. We're talking about going way beyond just coding to becoming like a strategic, adaptable, problem-solving ninja. What else does this mental boot camp have for us?
This is really making me realize that there's so much more to coding than just, the actual writing code part.
Oh, for sure. It's a super mentally demanding field. And the article really gets that. Like, it doesn't sugarcoat it.
Yeah.
It actually gets into some additional techniques that, at first they might seem kind of simple, but they can have a huge impact.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
One that really stood out to me was this thing called the Feynman technique.
The Feynman technique. That sounds very official.
It sounds way more complicated than it is, I promise.
Okay.
It's named after, the famous physicist, Richard Feynman.
Oh, right.
He was known for being able to explain these super complex topics in a way that anyone could understand.
Yeah, like making it simple.
Exactly. And his secret was this. If you really want to understand something, try to explain it to someone else. Like you're teaching it to them. So, like, I should explain it to my rubber duck.
Exactly. And it doesn't even have to be a person, honestly. It could be a rubber duck, your dog, the wall.
Right.
The point is, when you try to explain it simply, it forces you to really confront any gaps in your own understanding.
That's such a cool concept. I'm going to try that next time I'm stuck. And speaking of, learning and remembering, the article also talks about something called spaced repetition.
Yeah. This one's huge, honestly, and not just for coding, for learning anything, really.
Okay.
The basic idea is we actually remember information way better when we space out our review sessions instead of just cramming everything in at once.
So instead of doing that classic all-nighter before a big interview, it's better to review the material, like gradually over time.
Way better.
Interesting.
I know, it feels counterintuitive, but when you let yourself forget some of that information and then you have to actively recall it, you're actually strengthening the connections in your brain.